Maybe this is just because I like to argue, but I think that you actually cannot argue someone else's story. Why is it so powerful to share our story?
I think the most important thing we have is the word of our testimony. Every time we share it, it really breaks the back of hell. I mean, there's just no question.
Yeah, when I think of sharing our story, I think of the role it has in dispelling shame. And first, it's the shame in our own lives, because even if we're experiencing healing or have more health, there are those voices or those past wounds that make us feel like, yeah, but if others knew, they would reject you. But when we're able to share our story, and we definitely have to be aware of a right time and a right place, that we don't want to just try to share our whole story with everybody right away. I kind of think about it like the further we get in healing, the bigger the audience can be to share our story. Yeah. So the more healing that's there, the more free we can be with it. Early on, maybe it's just in our group or with our spouse or a close friend that we feel we can start opening up with. But as we share that story and we're public in giving words to what happened to us and what God's doing, we realize we're not hiding behind our past anymore, that we're now seeing God use it. And the way that just releases us from our own sense of shame, and actually we get the joy of watching others be impacted, because that's really the second purpose of dispelling the shame, is that when someone else hears our story and hears that God's at work and sees that hope is possible, it really can communicate to them it's okay not to be okay, and it's okay to talk about this, and that hope is possible. And now maybe the very thing that they've been living with as well, or maybe a spouse of theirs is living with, they realize, man, I can do something about it. And so it's like we talk a lot about at our events when we bring up 2 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul says that God comforts us so that we can comfort others. Not that we can be comfortable and just be happy and alone, but so that we can have a message. And that's like Dr. Ted says all the time, that the very places we've been wounded are where we're the most gifted, that God uses that story. So I think just defeating the enemy of shame, that's the primary weapon of Satan in so many people's lives. That's what sharing our story does, is it defeats shame in us and in others, and just opens doors for God to work in our lives and in others in ways that otherwise I don't think he can.
Yeah. Maybe this is just because I like to argue, but I think that you actually cannot argue someone else's story. Like if I tell you theologically that healing's possible, or that you can't have an addiction as a Christian, someone can argue me biblically, theologically, wherever
what
they...
What about this? Have you read this article?
So if I'm sharing my story, I'm also not posturing as a theological thing. I'm just sharing my experience. And what's coming to mind is we spoke at a youth event this last year in Florida. And that was one of the things that I remember saying and remember connecting with the kids. I asked them who likes to argue and said, I can beat you. Watch, I'll share my story and then try to argue me, because you can't. And so I think that that's also part of it, that you're not, and we'll get into, some of the ways to do this better, but in reality, you cannot tell me that my experience wasn't my experience.
Well, and especially in a day and age where we're in postmodernism, where there is no absolute truth. Really, though, the primary or the absolute truth that remains is personal truth. So for you to be sharing your personal truth, I think someone can look at it and say, boy, your personal truth seems better than mine. What you're experiencing is better than what I'm experiencing. The freedom, the joy, the meaning and purpose in your life. And so even if a person rejects God, Scripture, any kind of absolute truth, your personal truth is powerful to them.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, there's so much power in your story. I know for me, I've told my story 1,000 times, probably, and every time it's super emotional. But every time I share it, I can feel just more layers coming off. And I think that's what makes it real for other people, because you're literally speaking to right where they're at. Right.